The 39th President of the United States, James Earl Carter Jr., also known as Jimmy Carter, was born on October 1, 1924. Carter grew up in Plains, Georgia, following his Baptist faith and helping with the family peanut farm he lived on. Carter attended the Naval Academy, where he continued a 7-year career in the Navy until 1953. Carter also married Rosalind Smith and had 4 kids, John, James, Donald, and Amy. After the Navy, Carter found himself back in Georgia helping with the family peanut farm. Jimmy Carter started his political career by being on the local Board of Education. Then he quickly found himself winning the state Senate in 1962 and again in 1964. After his time in the Senate, Carter found himself failing to bid for governorship. When running again for governorship in 1970, Carter took the segregationist approach to gain supporters. But in Carter's inaugural address, he states, "The time of racial discrimination is over." As governor, he came to a national attention, finding his way onto the cover of Times Magazine as a symbol of both good government and the New South. After the Watergate scandal, Carter felt the next president needed to be an outsider. Carter was 1 out of 10 Democratic candidates and was probably the least known. People liked the idea of an outsider because they were so mad with the typical politics. Carter's appeal was his major ideas and his outsider status and integrity. "I'll never tell a lie," Carter famously declared. "I'll never avoid a controversial issue." Although the election turned out much closer than initially expected, Carter nevertheless won to become the 39th President of the United States of America.
The end of Ford's presidency left the nation with numerous domestic problems, so President Carter was left to deal with unemployment, inflation, and an energy crisis. He spent the majority of his presidency battling these major issues. President Carter described the nation's energy crisis as the most pressing issue in the nation. He believed that Americans were too reliant on crude oil, so he urged the nation to cut oil and gas consumption during one of his fireside chats. To begin, Carter proposed over 100 ideas to Congress regarding energy conservation and development. In 1978, he passed the National Energy Act, which placed a tax on gas-guzzling automobiles. With the act came the creation of the Department of Energy, which regulated existing energy suppliers and funded research for sustainable energy alternatives. Despite President Carter's efforts to help the energy crisis, they were met with some opposition from oil and gas-producing states and automobile manufacturers. President Carter thus had to undergo many legislative battles to make these changes. In the end, by 1979, the United States gradually began to depend less on foreign oil, and the nation's energy crisis was slightly resolved. Unfortunately, Carter's effort to help the economic crisis was not as successful. The economy was in ruins due to continuous violence in the Middle East and the increasing oil prices. In 1979, inflation soared from 7.6% to 11.3%. As an attempt to fix this, Carter proposed multiple ideas such as stimulating the economy with deficit spending and cutting federal expenses, but none of which worked. Thus, many Americans were convinced that Carter had no economic policy. President Carter responded in what is now known as the May Lee speech that there was a crisis of spirit in the nation. This speech made Americans feel that he had given up. With Carter's unsuccessful efforts, the economy was still getting worse and inflation climbed to 14% in 1980, the highest it had been since 1947. Carter's inability to help the economic crisis caused his popularity to drop. Carter also focused on some social issues. He signed the Department of Education Organization Act into law and created the Department of Education, which gave more control to local school districts and cut unnecessary federal regulations. President Carter was an advocate for civil rights. He had a very diverse administration and appointed the first African American as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He aimed to close the gap between whites and African Americans, and he was a strong supporter of affirmative action. Overall, President Carter's domestic record was not successful as he spent the majority of his presidency struggling to battle the nation's long-term issues.
Jimmy Carter, in the time of his presidency, had many foreign policy goals. His effectiveness in foreign affairs is still debated today, but like all presidents, his actions left a mark on the world. During his campaign, it was made very clear that he was to work very hard to promote universal human rights. Committed to the protection and advancement of human rights as a keystone to his foreign policy, proved to be very beneficial amongst his popularity and essentially won him his place in office. He believed foreign policy should be rooted on the moral values of Americans' freedoms and liberties listed in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and should be spread around the world. This philosophy, though, did not come without its critics. Containment policy supporters felt that this would undermine allies such as Nicaragua, a dictatorial but anti-communist country. Further criticism was drawn when Carter's administration announced their plan to give up the Panama Canal. In 1977, he signed two treaties known as the Carter-Torrijos Treaties that would give Panama back its control over the Panama Canal. This ended the agreement that Roosevelt had made with Panama in 1904 that gave the U.S. rights to build the canal. In his address to the nation, Carter stated, "The new treaties give us what we do need, not ownership of the canal, but the right to use it and to protect it." Panamanians approved the treaties because they felt the previous treaty was disadvantageous and unfair to them. Over time, officials worked hard to ease relations with China and the Soviet Union. However, Carter's insistence on human rights drove a breakdown in relations with the Soviet Union. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979, Carter became furious and refused to enter into any agreements that had previously been made. On other terms, the greatest foreign policy success of Carter's presidency had involved the Middle East. He was able to help forge peace between longtime enemies, Israel and Egypt. Carter invited Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egypt's President Anwar Sadat to sit down in Camp David and line out terms of peace. Upon both sides agreeing to the terms of this treaty, Israel would withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula and both governments would acknowledge each other in peace. In this case, the U.S. would establish monitoring posts to ensure neither side attacked the other. Furthermore, the Iran hostage crisis was one of Carter's biggest challenges. The Shah of Iran, a United States ally, fell from power due to Iranians resenting his corrupt and dictatorial regime. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini led the rebels in overthrowing the Shah and establishing a religious state based on strict obedience to the Quran. Because he was an ally, Carter allowed the Shah to enter the United States for cancer treatment. Infuriating many Iranians, on November 4, 1979, armed students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. They demanded that the U.S. send the Shah back to Iran in return for the release of hostages. A long and painful standoff began when Carter refused to give in to their demands. With his administration working hard to get the hostages back, Americans were becoming very frustrated. Overall, this event doomed Carter politically and dropped his approval ratings. The hostages were released after 444 days of captivity.
The legacy Carter left behind was one of the many accomplishments, yet also filled with many failures and mistakes that negatively impacted the United States. Today, there is an increased appreciation for the measures he partook in to deal with the numerous crises he's faced. For taking up office in just 30 months after the previous president had left the entire federal government in shambles, Carter's presidency can be seen as mediocre, especially in the face of many issues ranging from the energy crisis, Iran, Soviet aggression, and a deep mistrust of leadership by the citizens of the United States. Politically, Carter revived a dormant practice of presidential mediation in national disputes. By insisting the American leadership to prioritize the protection of human rights globally, he helped to subvert the power of communist and other dictatorial regimes that eventually led to human rights initiatives in the 1980s and 1990s. Although his greatest asset was his stubborn independence in his climb to presidency, it also served as his downfall during his office. This, along with a combination of many other characteristics, branded him as ineffectual. Whether it was his inability to resolve the Iran crisis or his inability to build coalitions and to be flexible when compromising with friends and foes, or his refusal to engage in a give and take with Congress, these all contributed to his negative legacy. In his foreign affairs, he brokered the first in a series of largely ineffective and incredibly damaging Arab-Israeli peace treaties. Carter's agreements only strengthened the disdain towards Israel from its Arab neighbors, leading only to further violence. Another one of his long-term implications include the Israel-Egypt peace treaty signed by the Egyptian president and Israeli prime minister. Although peace has been maintained between Egypt and Israel up to this day, the increased hostility in Egypt towards Jews and Israel has been the worst of Carter's legacy. He also traveled to North Korea for a peacekeeping mission and brokered a deal with the dictator without approval from the Clinton administration. Consequently, the United States ended up providing aid, oil, and material for building light-water nuclear reactors in exchange for abandoning their nuclear weapon programs, which North Korea did not follow through on. Furthermore, by abandoning the Shah, Carter unintentionally caused the Islamic Revolution, which involved the murder and imprisonment of many Iranian leftists who had supported overthrowing the Shah. This eventually emboldened the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan, as well as leading up to the rise of radical Islam worldwide. Carter's mismanagement of the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979 inspired Islamic terrorists all over the world as seen in 9/11. Overall, Carter's numerous failures outweighed his accomplishments during his presidency. His failed approach to foreign policy put America in a perilous position. He made many enemies among both Republican and Democratic administrations by undermining their foreign policies and attempted an array of measures to combat the economic crisis in the United States, none of which worked. Thus, Carter's popularity slipped as many Americans felt that their president had given up upon, ultimately resulting in his downfall and leaving the future generations of America to handle the ripples of effect of his negative legacy.